there's so much I really want to hit, so I'm going to try and skip ahead on occasion. My name is Jose. I work with a group called crimelabs. We're presenting a paper today on the discussion of where we think network worms are going. Obviously, the future of internet worms. They've gotten a lot of press lately. They've gotten a lot of attention, and we think that we're going to see a paradigm shift in what worms have to offer. During the day, I'm actually a biochemist, and I mention this because some of the things that I've been doing have actually been looking at living systems for how they use complexity and adaptability and applying this to security, both in terms of attacks as well as defenses. This work is part of that, and I hope that we can show some more of the things later on that we've been doing. Thank you very much for showing up, and this is a great opportunity for me, and I want to thank the Black Hat people for that. When we first started out, some of the guys were worried that we were essentially building a terrorist handbook, kind of a how-to manual, how to take down the internet with a worm in maybe 30 days or less. So I want to state quite clearly what our intentions are. We're not interested in putting together a worm system like this. We've written some of the components just to test it out, but we're not going to put them together. We're not interested in helping anybody put this together. Our goals are to get people thinking about how to detect and defend against such a worm system. In monitoring what's happened recently with worms like Ramen and other Windows worms, we see that our defense and detection strategies are somewhat lagging behind where they need to be. So we want to get people thinking about this. And Black Hat's a great opportunity to bring some good minds together and to start thinking about these kinds of things. That said, let's move on to the whole presentation. Briefly, going to introduce what worms are, where they are right now, and discuss the 6 components that we've identified in worm nodes and worm systems. We're going to discuss some of the problems that we see in current worm paradigms, and it's important to understand these problems and these limitations to see where we think they're going to evolve. And lastly, and most importantly, we want to introduce some of the ideas for detection and defense strategies that worms will require. And of course, we're going to wrap it up with some conclusions. I've broken up into the talk several question slides, so feel free to ask questions on a slide or wait for a break in the middle of the talk for some questions if you'd like. And in fact, I've got a t-shirt to give away to one of the more interesting questions, so feel free to come up with something good. Worm systems are really nothing more than automated intrusion agents. They acquire a node, which begins to scan for new vulnerabilities and rather newly vulnerable nodes. It launches against them, and if it compromises them, it's acquired a new node, which can repeat this process. This is somewhat like viruses, but unlike viruses, worms are self-propelled. Viruses require a carrier program to kind of execute them and help them along, whereas worms are able to just simply execute on their own timescale. This is an important distinction because worms have to now somehow acquire the capabilities of executing on the host. Worms have a colorful history, perhaps being punctuated best by the 1988 Morse worm, which took down a good chunk of the internet by exploiting vulnerabilities found in sun systems and VAX systems. And it's rather disconcerting to see many of the vulnerabilities that we saw abused by the Morse worm still present on the internet on a wide scale. In the past several years, we've seen persistent Windows worms going through file sharing systems as well as internet systems. And if you look through a virus defense company's database, you're going to see several worms listed there. In the past year or so, we've seen a dramatic increase in Linux worms, such as Ramen, Adore, and Lion. These are showing us somewhat how easy it is to write worms, as well as where they might be going. I list several examples here, such as the Win32 Bremer worm, which is an interesting worm that actually installed the RC5 client from distributed net to crack keys for this guy Bremer. The Linux Ramen Worm shows just how easy it is to write a successful worm, how much damage they can do. And the multi-platform Sadman D and IIS worm uses compromised sunboxes to deface IIS web pages. In our paper, we actually dissect 3 worms in terms of our 6-component model, but we don't really have time to get into that today. Worms have been and will continue to be a threat for 2 main reasons. First of all, they're relatively easy to put together. Dissecting the Ramen code, it just simply shows a few shell scripts attached to some precompiled exploits that the author didn't even really write. So it takes simply a little more work to put together a worm system that can actually work and spread. But once you've written it and now you've launched it, you're done, and the worm keeps on working. Rapidly acquires lots of hosts, lots of nodes, and unlike you, who has to sometimes step away from your terminal to go to work, to go to school, to go to sleep, the worm is continually working, and it's working at an exponential pattern. This leads to the worm nodes being pervasive on the network. They're constantly weeding out the weakest targets. This can allow them to penetrate very difficult to enter networks. Ramen, for example, was found on the NASA network because it found one of the weaker Linux boxes available. We foresee 2 real futures for worms, and we're only going to be talking about one of them at length today. The one that we're not going to be talking about concerns itself with small increases in how things are going to be going on. We're going to see better rootkits for hiding the processes associated with the worm, the use of kernel modules for added capabilities, and for stealth. And we're going to see an incorporation of encryption for network communications and perhaps even payloads to hide their presence on the network. And we're going to start seeing better attack capabilities in these worms. Looking at most of the worms out there, they're abusing very well-known exploits and very well-known vulnerabilities which have well-known patches. They may be a year old in some cases. There's really no reason why people can't be using zero-day exploits to really catch people off guard. What we're going to be focusing on instead is a paradigm shift. The existing worm paradigm has the children looking identical to the parents and worms being static, such that once they're introduced, that's it. That's all your worm is capable of. We expect to see a paradigm shift away from that and towards dynamic worms. The 6 components of the worms that we've talked about are listed here, and we're going to elaborate on them in the next few slides. We have a reconnaissance or scanning component, which actively seeks out new systems. Having identified systems that you may want to attack, you have to attack them. Having acquired a node, you have to be able to command it. And you have to communicate with it. And you have to know where they are and how to communicate with them, so you have to have some sort of intelligence database that lists out where your nodes are. And lastly, for lack of a better term, we have kind of a catch-all category of unused and non-attack capabilities that don't necessarily fit into any of these above 5 categories. As I said, the reconnaissance component is nothing more than target identification. You're actively scanning, in some cases, doing service sweeps of a network, or identifying a network and going down and scanning to identify what kinds of hosts you have available to you. Active scanning uses a stimulus to elicit a response. Usually IP packets, port scanners, those kinds of things. In the past year and a half or so, we've seen a dramatic increase in the capabilities of passive methods, which allow you to identify the operating systems and vulnerabilities on the basis of watching the traffic that's going by. Here, the scanning system doesn't have to send any traffic. It can simply observe an existing conversation and identify what's going on there. Specific attacks include the ubiquitous buffer overflow or the string format attacks, the abuse of CGI bin scripts, and the like. Very popular in the Windows world are Trojan horse injections, where you'll sometimes leave a file available on the network, which actually is actually part of the worm system. These are usually limited in their targets on the basis of the attacks that are listed there, and they usually have 2 components to them. that which has to run locally on the worm node and remotely on the system that you would want to compromise. Having acquired a node, you now have to be able to communicate with it and offer it commands. So we have a command interface. This can be as simple as an administrative shell, like command.exe on an NT machine, or a root shell on a Unix machine, where you actively connect to the worm node. Or it could be a network client, like we see sometimes in the Windows world, where the worm node contacts out. This can be useful in getting past firewalls, which are quite liberal in their outbound connections, but very restrictive on their inbound connections. The command interface accepts instructions either from a person sitting at a terminal actively telling the machine what to do, or another worm node. For example, in the Ramen Worm, the command interface is nothing more, the command interface rather, is nothing more than simply saying, give me the worm package. The communications channels allow inter-node communications. So we have here the transfer of information, including commands or data, and this can occur over a variety of protocols. IP protocols such as TCP or UDP or even ICMP could be over web requests. Really, the possibilities here are quite open-ended. Sometimes you'll see concerns about trying to keep the presence of the worm network quiet, and so you'll see an incorporation of stealth capabilities, either encryption or other traffic hiding capabilities. Okay, sounds good. He's going to get both projectors going, so he's going to disconnect me for a second. Hold on a second. Sorry about that. The intelligence database is essentially the map of the worm network. You have to know about where these other nodes are and how to contact them and communicate with them. It can be concrete in the sense that you have a mailbox or a host that is accepted, for example, specific packets from the worm nodes that lists out where they are, or it can be somewhat abstract. Often in the Windows world, we see worms using IRC channels, and their presence on that channel is simply the intelligence database. A complete database is, in one place, a full listing of all the worm nodes. This, of course, has a dramatic point of failure, such that if this node is compromised, the full listing of the worm network is now available to those who've compromised it. An incomplete database, or a distributed database, works much like DNS, and where you have pieces in any one spot of a listing there, such that if any one of those is compromised, the entire network is not compromised. And lastly, our catch-all category here includes the remainder of the exploits that were not used. Often worms will carry with them several exploits, and the ones that were not used to gain entry into the system will fall in here. Or other non-exploit capabilities, such as cracking encryption, as I mentioned with the Win32 Bremer worm, which used the distributed net RC5 client, or in the case of the Morris worm, password cracking. And you can see this leaves us various possibilities here, and it's rather open-ended. Putting these together graphically, we can see here two worm nodes, A and B. A on the left wants to send a command to B on the right. And so through the command, the communications interface, it sends a stream to node B, which accepts it on its communications interface and passes it up to the command interface. I want to take a few moments and answer any questions that might arise over this section. Yes?
I was wondering basically about the purpose that you see in worms in general. I mean, other than the, oh, hey, look, I defaced a website, I affected so many machines, have you actually seen cases where information is being stolen, used for other purposes, installing other, control programs? Can you elaborate on that?
The question is, what am I observing at this stage in terms of worm purposes? Is it simply joyriding, or is there some sort of directive there going on? Most of the high-profile worms out there seem to be simply, look, I can write a worm. I can infect 1,000 machines in a day. But they definitely have the capabilities of downloading files or erasing files. One of the problems, however, is that worms don't really have any sort of directionality to them. They simply spread. And so in terms of acquiring a specific target, you're rather limited there. Of course, you may want to introduce it, say, for example, into a corporate network, where you could steal files in an opportunistic fashion. That's definitely possible. It's not popular yet, but it's certainly available. Yes?
Are you familiar with some of the work that's going on defining a concept known as autonomous nodes? And if so, what do you think about the notion of a worm that is, it just goes in its way and it's utterly unresponsive to anything else and accepts no input?
The question is the idea of an autonomous worms network. Actually, we may not be able to get to it because of time concerns, but we actually discuss a guerrilla network kind of structure, which definitely maps onto what you discussed there, this autonomous worm network, where it doesn't accept, as you said, doesn't accept input from other channels. This has the advantage of being quite resistant to attack, right? You have these cells that operate independently. They're rather difficult to write, and they're rather difficult to make do anything useful because they're certainly going to overlap very quickly. But in the paper, unfortunately probably won't get to it because of time concerns, we do discuss a guerrilla network structure. So let's move on to the next section where we discuss the current limitations that are existing in the worm paradigm. We have limited capabilities due to them being static. Once you've introduced a worm, that's it. That's all you have available to you for reconnaissance and attack capabilities. And we're going to see the consequences of those. Worms typically have a very exponential growth pattern, leading to dramatic increases in traffic, which will cause problems as well. I mentioned just a moment ago the network structure giving problems as well. We may discuss that if time permits. And lastly, the atypical intelligence database and the various problems associated with how those are implemented. These limited capabilities initially start with the reconnaissance capabilities. Here we have a worm node that knows about how to scan for 5 vulnerabilities. And it has a small network here of 5 nodes that it wants to scan for these vulnerabilities. So it hits the first one and tries 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And depending on what it gets back, it then goes on to the next one. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. You immediately know what's going to happen with the third target. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Your network intrusion detection system will quickly flag this as interesting traffic, and if it's adaptive, you may actually put up a blockade against this. Furthermore, when it comes time to attack a potential target, here we have a worm node that knows 3 attacks. If 1, 2, or 3 are possible against this target, it will attack, and it may or may not succeed. Otherwise, it'll abort and move on to the next target. If the target is not vulnerable to any of these 3, it's not going to fall victim here. Again, once you've introduced the worm, this is it. This is all you have typically are these limited capabilities. If the system is patched or simply not vulnerable in the first place, it won't fall victim here. This worm network will also have exponentially growing traffic. Kind of an ugly equation that doesn't make a whole lot of sense sometimes. Here we have the traffic of the worm being related to to its growth constant k, the number of nodes n and their mean traffic for scans, communications, and the like, as well as a time dependence t. So as time moves on, and with an aggressive worm that has a high rate constant of infection, k, we're going to rapidly see the worm traffic become very high profile. And you can see the fraction of the worm traffic is simply the traffic of the worm over the total traffic of the network. Typically, worm traffic is well below 1% of the total network traffic due to just how much is out there. But in terms of anomalies, it quickly rises to being very high profile, exposing the worm. Graphically plotting the observations against the infection round, we can see here in a scenario where we have, say, 11,000 machines that are vulnerable to the attacks the worm can carry out. So we have a sigmoidal approach to the total number of infected machines that we can acquire. But we have this exponential and rapid increase in the actual worm traffic of scans, failed attacks, and communications. And so you can see quickly that the worm will become very visible. Furthermore, for a high-profile node, if it's an intelligence database or a command node, early on you're going to have a little bit of traffic trickling in. Later on, traffic will pour in as more nodes have to send updates or communications to this node, again raising its profile. Simple traffic analysis will reveal that. Typical worm networks are fan-shaped. So you acquire one node, and it begins to acquire as many as it can, and each of those continue to acquire as many as they can. So you have this highly branching fan structure. These introduce vulnerabilities if there's a command hierarchy as well here. So you can simply hit high up the chain, which you can identify through traffic analysis, and you can take out a good chunk of the worm network that way. And as the gentleman in the third row asked about directionality, or rather, second row, asked about directionality, if, for example, you want to target a specific network, you have very limited capabilities about directing where this worm will go. Remember, it's trying to spread as fast and as far as possible, and you don't want to limit it initially about where it can go. So here we have a target network which only has one worm node available within it, but you have all these other nodes. Granted, you didn't expend a whole lot of effort to get them, but you have this very high-profile worm network. And so the presence of this worm in your target network is probably going to be found very quickly. Your intelligence database is also a vulnerable point as well. In the case of the Ramen Worm, we saw email messages with information about the source system being compromised in part of the worm network. Going to Hotmail accounts. It's very simple. It's a very simple signature, and so you can easily put up a block to isolate the intelligence database and prevent updates. Now you have these nodes that are out there, but you don't know where they are, so they become useless for you. So simply put, worms, as they stand currently, are highly visible and easily blocked because they have very simple to acquire signatures. Plug that into your intrusion detection system, plug that into your firewall, plug that into your patching strategy of your hosts, and you can easily prevent the worm from spreading. Their structure of fanning out as fast as possible leaves them unable to achieve a specific target, and in general, worms are readily identified. So take a second here and answer any questions. Yes?
In the equation that you gave earlier with regarding the traffic rate coming off the worm,
Yes.
you had growth rate constant K.
Yes.
And that was going to be a pretty critical factor. If the worm grows too fast, it swamps the network, builds its own host, self-defeating. If it's too slow, it doesn't spread. Do you see any evidence that virus fighters are deliberately tuning to get an optimum value of growth rate, or is it just hit or miss and hope that it works out?
Some of the better virus, okay, so the question was, are virus writers and potentially worm writers trying to tune the growth rate constant K from that equation I showed earlier to kind of find the balance between defeating yourself through visibility and swamping your network and not spreading fast enough such that you become ineffective? The answer is the better virus writers and some of the better worm writers are in fact doing this. They're putting timing values in such that you'll wait, say, half an hour between a scan and an attack, or you'll wait maybe a day between infection rounds, such that you don't raise your profile too fast, and such that you don't swamp out yourself through traffic. You know, viruses like Melissa quickly became well known because they shut down networks. The lion worm quickly became visible because it was so aggressive, and it was failing. And here you had all these distinct networks that were seeing the same traffic within the same time frame. Over the course of a weekend, lion was exposed.
By the same token, do you see deliberate choices with respect to whether the worms are destructive, deliberately destructive of their hosts, or whether they simply try to propagate?
The question is then, is this design strategy used? Is it in this design strategy? Is it related to the destructiveness or the spread concerns of the worm or the virus? And the answer is, like I said, some of the better virus writers and some of the better worm writers who really want to have something useful for them go on, whether it's simply a political event, simply shutting down a network. They'll definitely want to spread more slowly, keep their profile kind of low, but useful. And so we're definitely seeing that, such that at a later date they can begin to do something useful with this worm network. In the front here.
Do you see anything that are adaptive or phone home change? So I guess I come with the whole idea that it's easily blocked.
Well, the question is, are we seeing adaptive and dynamic updates? And the answer is, we're not yet seeing that, but we will. And that's the next section, actually. And so you're thinking ahead, and that's good.
So you're saying limited, the conclusion easily blocked in the case of what we've seen already. So far.
Exactly, the existing worm paradigms. So those are exactly easily blocked. Yes.
How does something like virus fit
This is what? Hybris? Hybris is definitely a step forward. And the question is, how does Hybris fit into this? Hybris is definitely a step forward and a step out of this existing paradigm. The authors obviously seeing the same kinds of limitations and seeing the same strategies for getting around them. And so in the next section, we're going to talk about that. So there's a question over here.
All the presentations you're talking about right now will be easily solved. I mean, I look at them and go, wow, just implement some algorithm and that comes away. You have some web pages on geodesics for free. Now you have dynamic updates. I can have, to try to expand, you're going to expand and then attack my target network.
Right. And so the question is, aren't these limitations easily gotten around? And the answer is yes, they are. And so that's what the next section is all about, and some of the strategies of how to do this, and then later on how to defend against that. Yes?
On the more legitimate end of worm research, you were talking about traffic acquisition and target acquisition and the level of traffic increases. Are you familiar with the research done by the site team using data mining techniques and expert systems to sort of plan an attack through a network and acquire specific targets?
The question is, am I familiar with the psych team's work on planning how you may, for example, want to infect a lot of hosts? And the answer is no, I'm not familiar with it. I do know that networks are incredibly difficult to model realistically, and the patterns that they go through are incredibly unpredictable. You can look back on them and you can say what caused a particular event, a spike in traffic or a lull in traffic or whatever, but predicting what's going to happen there is incredibly difficult to do. And so I'm kind of curious to see that research, but I know it's quite difficult to do. And most of the worm authors and most of the virus authors that we're observing so far aren't doing that. So let's move on to the next section. Had kind of a sneak peek with some of the questions. And what we're going to see is being widespread considerations for the worms. Dynamic behavior is obviously one of the major solutions to a lot of these problems. By allowing for updates and for allowing for polymorphism at the node level, you can definitely get past signature-based analysis and blocking. We're definitely seeing an increased use of covert communications mechanisms, and we're going to start to see these appear in worms. And some new infection strategies as well may appear. And we've already talked about a little bit about network topologies. May have to cut some of this out because of time concerns, and as well as communications topologies And then lastly, some new targets that will definitely have to be considered for worms. One of the best places to behave dynamically for the worm network is at the communications level. We've already seen this with the TFN2K DDoS network, such that the nodes can communicate over a variety of channels. In this case, we have a 4-node worm network that's communicating over several different kinds of channels. So nodes 1 and 2 are communicating over TCP channels, but nodes 1 and 3 are communicating over an asynchronous channel, where 1 communicates with 3 over DNS updates, and 3 communicates back with 1 over ICMP packets. 3 and 4 communicate over the web, and so on and so forth, and such that if you've isolated one pair of worm nodes, you don't know what's going on with the rest of them. This is an effective strategy adopted by TFN2K, and we're definitely going to start seeing it in worm nodes. The idea of polymorphic behaviors is somewhat popular on the level of maybe 2 to 5% with viruses, and there's really no reason why authors of worms will not begin to adopt this strategy as well. So here we have a 12-component worm, but it dynamically invokes 3 of them, 1 for communications channels, 1 for a suite of attacks, and 1 for a platform to attack or platform to run on. When you look at the next worm that has the same 12 components, it may not invoke the same 3 components at one time. So analyzing one node doesn't tell you anything about the next node. One of the biggest components of this paradigm shift is the idea that not every node has to look like every other node. The child does not have to look like the parent. And this can give rise to dynamic network rules, for example. So here we have a three-node network using a reconnaissance node to acquire information about a potential target and passing this through an intelligence database to an attack node, which lacks reconnaissance capabilities, which now can attack the target. We have 3 separate signatures for these worm nodes. Even though they're acting as one worm network, they're not all looking the same. By identifying these components, these 6 components, it becomes readily evident at how you might want to piece these together in selective strategies. We're going to see an increased use of updates to these nodes, such that what you've introduced initially isn't what you have on day 2, for example. So here we publish an update, a new attack, a new communications component, and the worm nodes can retrieve this from a server such as a pseudo-anonymous web server like GeoCities, or even Usenet, one of my favorite distributed communications mechanisms. There's definitely a rise of interest in steganography, the science of embedding messages within other messages. So we can embed commands in images, for example, on Usenet, on eBay, really anywhere on the web that you want to go. You can embed them in text messages or even music files. Distributed networks make great places to hide. Peer-to-peer networks like Freenet or Gnutella or Napster make a great place to stuff a file that can be downloaded somewhat anonymously. And the source point doesn't have to be identified at that point. Usenet also makes a very attractive place to spread, to widely spread traffic as well. And due to their high volume, it's impossible to monitor successfully web traffic and and email traffic as well. So those make great places to hide. This then gives rise to things like stealth broadcasts, where we have a message M prime, which is actually a somewhat innocuous looking message M plus your command lowercase m, publish on the server, and your nodes download and retrieve this message. You definitely want to start thinking about signing these updates, because this is definitely a point of vulnerability. So minimal public key infrastructure, allowing where they're published being signed by the private key, and they're extracted using the public key, can definitely be used to verify the source, the integrity of the source, to somewhat prevent poison injections. Got only a few minutes left, so I'm going to try and skip over the next few slides. They're definitely there in the paper. They're there in your notes there in front of you as well. But I want to hit really our major focus here, and that is detection and defense strategies. Worms give us new challenges in detection and defense strategies. They're incredibly fast-moving, typically, faster than you can move. So by the time you've identified it as being a worm, it's already widespread. And you're losing the game very quickly there, because they're always adding new nodes. The traditional worm paradigm makes it somewhat easy, though. So you've identified, you capture a node, and you analyze it. You watch its traffic, you identify its components, and now you know what all of the rest of the worm nodes look like, because they all have the same signature. Initial worm events are very hard to distinguish between a growing worm network and aggressive or scripted attackers. But like I said, by the time you've identified it as being a worm network, you're losing the game quite rapidly. Correlation analysis on a large-scale network will definitely be useful here. Correlation analysis is a mathematical analysis of two variables, usually in a time-dependent fashion. So you look at their interconnectedness. Here, our two variables are scans and attacks. Autocorrelation analysis looks at the time-dependent interconnectedness of the same variable with itself. So in this case, the presence of scans that have the same signature over a wide network in the same time frame would have a high correlation, or the same for attacks. Cross-correlation would look at the follow-up of attacks with scans, again, over a wide network in the same time frame. Because of the exponential growth traffic of worms, they're going to quickly rise in their correlation of scans and attacks. Dynamic worms represent new challenges because now you have to identify all the communications channels that they have available to them, as well as the scans and attacks they have available to them. And these are constantly changing, so you always have to be on the move. Putting this together in terms of a larger picture becomes quite difficult to do. It's very easy to simply say, defense in depth, keep up to date on your patches, install the NIDs, pay attention to it, install host detection systems, pay attention to them. We keep saying that, no one's doing it right, so we're going to just go ahead and skip right past that. You gotta answer your phone, man. Detection strategies that appear to be some of the best suited for worms are anomaly detection, where you look at statistical anomaly, not behavioral anomaly. This is incredibly hard to do, though. Agent-based intrusion detection systems are somewhat becoming popular, with things like zone alarm being kind of a minimal agent-based intrusion detection system. You have to focus on the common parts here, though. There's essentially kind of a glue layer that holds this dynamic worm system together. And that's what you're going to have to focus your detection strategies on. I pointed out a great vulnerability in dynamic worm networks, and that is you can inject poison or null components. So here you basically forge the source of these updates to these worm nodes with an empty payload or a shutdown payload. Zombie Zapper kind of does this with DDoS rings. You can do this also with worm rings. Simply inject a brand new module for attacks that actually does nothing. Traffic analysis is going to be very vital here to identify the presence of a worm network and the partners within it and how they're communicating. This is incredibly labor intensive, though, especially in a dynamic worm network. Having introduced those defense and detection strategies, I'm going to call it quits here. We've got about 5 minutes before 10 o'clock. I need to go get some coffee. I know some of you do as well. We're going to see worms evolving. They're too popular as it stands, and they're attractive as a means for bringing down large-scale networks. There's going to be a paradigm shift that's going to increase in prevalence, where not all the nodes look alike, because they're update capable. And here the idea of using a signature to analyze these becomes impossible to do. The guys at crimelabs have been especially helpful in this work. I'm sorry I couldn't be a little more in-depth, time constraints and the like, the size of the paper. Get the paper, it's going to be up next week at crimelabs.net. Rick and Chris and Jeremy have been especially helpful in drafting it, bouncing some ideas off. Rick's a great editor, so the writing is definitely due to him. Brandon and Ben, other guys in crimelabs, have been helpful in some feedback, but they didn't directly participate in this paper. Out to the crimelabs, Michael Zalewski has been really helpful in putting out some new ideas for worms. His paper from last year was incredibly inspiring. Simple Nomad, he and I have had some great conversations on this topic, and Doug Song as well. And of course, the Black Hat community. Thank you so very much. And I'd like to take some questions at this time. Yes?
You see, with regards to injecting damaged, poison, malformed, or even null components to a full worm into place, do you see there possibly being, I can see in my mind the option for a box of percent on the network that would have a certain type of response to that, where it's poison and as locally or poison across the arc in such a way so that there's a redirect. Do you see there being a development like that on the defense, or I should say active defense side?
The question is, in the same sense of actively injecting null or poison payloads, would it be possible to develop a network component that can redirect or misdirect worm traffic? That's definitely possible, but it requires a significant amount of traffic analysis to identify the presence of a worm, how they're communicating, and who's communicating. So as long as you're doing that, you may as well inject null or poison payloads to shut them down. It's definitely attractive, but there you're kind of assuming that the worm network will always be around. Thank you very much. Appreciate all of your attention.